The smell hits first rotten, sour, unmistakable. It's not just bad food, it's punishment. A tray slides through the slot, a piece of gray meat, cold rice clumped together, and a slice of bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. Inside Rikers Island, this isn't an accident. It's strategy. Inmates whisper about something called a hunger game, a quiet system of control. You talk back to an officer, your next few meals come special. You refuse a search, enjoy your tray full of mush. One inmate, Marcus Slim Hayes, once said during an interview from Rikers, they don't need chains when they got the kitchen. But what really happens behind those steel doors when food becomes a weapon? And how did America's most infamous jail turn meals, something meant to keep you alive, into a method of breaking your spirit? Stay with me. Rikers Island, located between Queens and the Bronx, isn't just a jail. It's a world within a world. By 2015, it held over 10,000 inmates, most of them awaiting trial, not convicted of any crime. Yet the place ran like a maximum security prison, with its own rules, its own economy, and its own punishments. Inside, food isn't about nutrition. It's about power. Former inmates describe the trays like lottery tickets. If you're lucky, your meal's edible. If not, it's punishment. One former detainee, Donnell Cooper, who was 19 when arrested for a nonviolent charge, told the Marshall Project in 2020, they fed us slop. Sometimes the milk was curdled. Other times, you'd find hair or even bugs. And if you said anything, they'd laugh and tell you not to eat. The correction officers didn't have to touch you to make you suffer. They just had to control your hunger. Inmates who spoke up or refused orders were placed in the restricted housing unit, known as the Bing. There, food was often weaponized, cold, stale, or simply withheld. Some men received what they called the loaf, a disciplinary meal meant to meet minimum calories but destroy morale. It's a mix of beans, flour, carrots, and mystery ingredients, baked into a tasteless brick. You could smell it down the tier. It wasn't always this way. Back in the early 2000s, before Mayor Bloomberg's reform attempts, Rikers still had a food services division that at least pretended to follow health codes. But as budget cuts deepened and corruption spread, the system decayed. Officers realized they could use food to manage behavior, quietly, without paperwork, without leaving marks. And in a place where everything, cigarettes, ramen, coffee, is currency, food became gold. Some inmates with connections in the kitchen started trading meal for favors. A few even built mini-empires by controlling who got the good trays. If you were on their bad side, you'd starve. Marcus Hayes described it best. They make you choose, stay quiet and eat, or speak up and starve. But Rikers didn't invent this tactic. Across America, jails have long used food as psychological warfare. In Mississippi's Parchman Farm during the 1960s, inmates were fed spoiled meat as punishment. In Chicago's Cook County Jail, report from 2018 showed trays served with mold and maggots. And yet, Rikers, sitting right in the heart of New York City, perfected it in plain sight. Late one night in 2017, inmate Jose Morales filed a grievance after finding roaches in his rice. 2 days later, his meals disappeared. Guards claimed he refused to eat. Morales lost 14 pounds in 3 weeks. His case went ignored. This is where the control deepens, not through violence, but through starvation. Because when hunger kicks in, even the strongest man bends. By 2021, Rikers was under national scrutiny. The pandemic had gutted staff numbers, and food service collapsed entirely. Videos leaked showing trays full of green bologna, soggy bread, and moldy fruit. New York City's Department of Correction promised reform, but former staff revealed that much of the rot came from within, officers ordering disciplinary portions off the record. Behind those walls, there's an unspoken rule. The kitchen doesn't just feed. It decides who survives. As one ex-officer, who spoke anonymously to the city in 2022, put it, food keeps order better than pepper spray. But that raises a darker question. If food is control, what happens when control turns into cruelty? Because soon after, inmates began to fight back, not with violence, but with their stomachs. And that's where things spiral into chaos. By the summer of 2019, word was spreading through the tiers of Rikers Island. quiet whispers carried on trays and folded napkins. The kitchen wasn't just a mess, it was a war zone. It began with small rebellions. A few inmates would refuse their trays, stacking them untouched by their cell doors. But soon, entire housing units began to coordinate. One officer later described it as organized chaos. Inmates called it the tray strike. It started in the Robert N. Devoren complex, a building mostly housing younger detainees between 18 and 21. On July 3rd, guards slid breakfast trays through the slots, watered down oatmeal, stale biscuits, and milk that smelled like chemicals. No one touched it. One by one, the trays piled up outside the cells. When the officers returned for lunch, it was the same story. Untouched food, the smell of protest filling the air. At first, staff laughed it off. They'll eat when they're hungry, one sergeant told a reporter later. But by the third day, tensions were boiling. Some inmates had gone nearly 72 hours without eating. They were dizzy, weak, and angry, but they weren't breaking. Behind the scenes, the leaders of the strike, including Marcus Slim Hayes, Raymond Figueroa, and Jamal Truth Harris, were working in secret, passing messages through the plumbing system and folded notes hidden in trash bags. Their demand was simple: stop using food as punishment. They wanted real meals, consistent portions, and accountability for officers who manipulated trays to control inmates. One note read, "If we can't eat with dignity, we won't eat at all." The administration called it a security concern. Officers began conducting random cell searches, confiscating commissary items, and shutting down phone privileges. But that only fueled the fire. Within a week, over 400 inmates across different units joined the hunger strike. News outlets began catching wind of it. The New York Times ran a short piece titled "Rikers Inmates Protest Food Conditions." But most of the public didn't understand how deep the issue went. They saw it as another complaint from inmates, not as a calculated system of psychological warfare had become. What the cameras didn't show was how food was used to reward compliance. If you worked with staff, your trays came clean, maybe even warm. If you kept your mouth shut, you might get double milk cartons. But if you challenged an officer, if you spoke out about abuse, your food got lost. A correction officer named Officer B. Daniels, who later testified in an internal investigation, revealed sometimes they'd just mark a guy's name on a list. That was enough. Next shift, his tray would accidentally be forgotten. They'd call it tray time discipline. By late August, the hunger strike had forced the administration to react. They brought in NYC Department of Health inspectors to tour the kitchen. What they found was horrifying. Expired meat stacked in warm storage, mold growing under dish racks, maggots near the cereal bins. And still, the inmates had to eat from it. The inspection report, which leaked months later, confirmed what inmates had been saying for years. The conditions weren't just bad, they were deliberately neglected. In response, the Department of Correction made a show of firing a few kitchen workers and replacing the food service vendor. But inside Rikers, nothing changed. That's when Marcus Hayes and his group decided to take things further. If they couldn't change the food system from the inside, they'd expose it to the outside. Using a smuggled cell phone, they began recording videos of the trays, the rotten meat, the soggy bread, the brown water that passed for soup. One of the clips, uploaded anonymously to social media, showed a breakfast tray crawling with small insects. The caption read, "This is how they feed us on Rikers Island. This is what control looks like." The video went viral overnight. News channels picked it up. Advocates called for investigations. City Hall scrambled to contain the backlash. But instead of reform came retaliation. The inmates believed they had won. But what happened next would remind everyone. The kitchen still held the real power. Because within a week of that viral video, the food shipments mysteriously stopped arriving. Meals were cut to one per day. Some inmates didn't eat for over 36 hours. It was no longer about control. It was about revenge. And for the men trapped behind those walls, hunger wasn't just a punishment anymore. It became a weapon they couldn't escape. By the fall of 2019, Rikers Island was boiling, not from heat, but from hunger. The viral footage had sparked outrage outside, but inside those crumbling walls, things were getting darker. The administration's response was quiet and strategic. They didn't rush in with pepper spray or riot gear. They didn't shout or make threats. Instead, they went after the one thing everyone needed: food. Meals were delayed, sometimes by 8 or 9 hours. When trays finally arrived, they came half empty, or worse, unrecognizable. Breakfast might be a single slice of white bread. Lunch, a cup of lukewarm beans. Dinner, nothing but water. Officers whispered about starvation rotation. One correction captain allegedly told his staff during roll call, they wanted attention, let them starve for it. And for a while, that tactic worked. The strike leaders, Slim, Figueroa, and Truth, were moved to separate housing units. The kitchen tightened its secrecy. Food records were shredded. And those caught filming faced disciplinary transfer, meaning isolation or even violence during transport. But what no one expected was that the retaliation would backfire. Inside the Otis Bantam Correctional Center, a low-slung facility known for housing older inmates, stories began spreading about the green mush. It was a new disciplinary meal, a blend of peas, soy, potatoes, and flour cooked into a brick-like slab. It had no name on paper, but inmates called it the block loaf. When eaten, it caused nausea and stomach pain. When refused, it was marked as meal denied. Either way, it punished you. A man named Andre Lewis, 42, who'd been in Rikers on a parole violation, told a journalist in early 2020, "They used to beat us. Now they feed us until we break down. Hunger, that's their new baton." Medical records from the facility showed dozens of inmates treated for malnutrition-related symptoms: dizziness, fainting, vomiting. But the official cause? Refusal to eat. It wasn't a coincidence. It was policy, unofficial but enforced. One former food service employee, speaking anonymously to the city in 2021, admitted, "We'd get direct calls from officers. They'd say, 'Cell 12, make his tray light.' Or, 'Cell 9, give him loaf only.' We didn't question it. If you did, you'd lose your job." But in the chaos, something unexpected was happening. Inmates started working together again, not through rebellion this time, but survival. Those who still had commissary food began sharing it. Tiny acts of solidarity spread like wildfire. A man with ramen noodles would split them between 3 others. Another with peanut butter would scrape half into a paper cup and slide it under his neighbor's door. At night, the sound of quiet tapping echoed through the tiers, Morse-like knocks between cells. It wasn't just talk. It was resistance. Slim, still separated in another unit, managed to get word to the others. "They can take the trays, but they can't take our story." That phrase became a rallying cry, scribbled on toilet paper, written in soap on walls, whispered through vents. Meanwhile, outside Rikers, a small coalition of advocates had started pushing City Hall to investigate. Among them was Jennifer Parrish, legal director of the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project. She'd been documenting food abuse for years. In a statement to the press, she said, "The way food is used at Rikers is inhumane. It's psychological torture disguised as policy. This isn't about safety, it's about domination." Her words hit hard, but the city's Department of Correction downplayed the issue, calling it isolated incidents. They didn't know that more footage was about to surface, footage that would prove it wasn't isolated at all. In December 2019, another video leaked. It showed a kitchen worker scooping slop from a bucket labeled waste. He poured it onto trays for inmate meals. The footage panned across dozens of trays lined up like an assembly line of punishment. The voice behind the camera, believed to be Truth, whispered, "This is what they feed us. Trash. Literally trash." Within hours, the video exploded online. It reached advocacy groups, news outlets, even city council members. Suddenly, Rikers couldn't hide. Investigators descended on the island. The New York State Commission of Correction opened a probe. City officials promised immediate review. But everyone inside knew Rikers had seen this movie before. Investigations came. Reports were written. Nothing changed. What made this moment different was the unity inside. For the first time, inmates and some staff were quietly aligned. A few officers, disgusted by what they saw, began leaking documents, meal orders, disciplinary logs, emails referencing food control strategy. One memo, later published by The Intercept, read, "Adjust portion for non-compliant detainees in RHU to incentivize cooperation." Incentivize cooperation, a polite way of saying starve them until they obey. The truth was finally bleeding out, but the administration wasn't done fighting back. Because in January 2020, as the investigations ramped up, something mysterious happened. The kitchen caught fire. Flames tore through storage areas and food prep zones, destroying equipment and supplies. Officials called it an accident caused by faulty wiring. But those inside whispered another theory. It wasn't an accident at all. Some believed it was arson, a deliberate attempt to erase evidence before inspectors could dig deeper. Whatever the truth, the aftermath was chaos. Food service was moved to emergency rations, canned meals and powdered soup. Inmates grew sick. Guards were overworked. And through it all, Marcus Hayes sat in his cell, staring at his next tray, a single slice of stale bread and a cup of gray liquid. He looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "They are trying to break us, but they forgot we've already been broken." Outside, the world had started to move on. The pandemic was weeks away from shutting everything down. But for the men of Rikers Island, another storm was brewing, one that would bring the world's attention back to their hunger, their resistance, and the system that refused to feed them with dignity. Because when COVID hit, food became not just control, but survival itself. And that's where the story takes a terrifying turn. When COVID-19 reached New York City in early 2020, Rikers Island became a ticking time bomb. The city was locking down. The world outside had stopped. But inside Rikers, the clock kept running, only slower, darker, and hungrier. Food deliveries from the mainland started to collapse. Truck drivers refused to come onto the island, citing safety concerns. And the few that did arrive were held for hours in security checkpoints, where the virus was already spreading among officers. That's when the system broke completely. Meals came later and later. Some days, not at all. By April, detainees were getting one meal a day, sometimes just a piece of bread, a boiled egg, and a small carton of milk that smelled like bleach. A man named Anthony Feliciano, who later spoke to the Gothamist, described it like this: "We weren't eating. We were surviving. You didn't complain, because the moment you did, your next tray wouldn't come at all." And now, the cruelty wasn't hidden anymore. It was policy. The kitchen workers, mostly inmates assigned to food duty, were collapsing from exhaustion. They worked double shifts, cleaning with diluted sanitizer that burned their hands raw. Most of them weren't given masks. They handled raw chicken and spoiled vegetables while coughing, sweating, and praying not to get sick. An inmate named James Tone Wallace later told the city, "We were feeding 4,000 men with supplies meant for half that. We mixed old beans with new ones, scraped mold off bread, and hoped nobody noticed." But people did notice. By May 2020, the smell of decay spread through the corridors. Rotten food piled up behind locked kitchen doors because no one was left to dispose of it. Rats ran across trays in the pantry areas. Yet those same trays went out, because there was no other choice. Officers began skipping units entirely during meal runs. They claimed COVID staffing issues. But inside, inmates knew it was something else. A new form of control, starvation disguised as safety. Marcus Slim Hayes was now in a quarantine dorm, sick but not critical. He'd lost almost 20 pounds. His cellmate, Eli Rivera, wrote in a hidden journal that later made it out through a lawyer, "We can't smell food anymore. Only bleach. We eat and pray we don't choke. We're ghosts waiting for someone to remember we exist." Outside the island, chaos was brewing in City Hall. News reports about Rikers' outbreak were everywhere. Hundreds of officers had tested positive. Inmates were dying. The mayor's office announced emergency reforms, including pre-trial releases and oversight over jail food services. But inside, those reforms didn't exist. Because the one thing Rikers always did best was hide the evidence. When inspectors called to check, the administration staged a kitchen. They cleaned the visible areas, tossed out the worst food, and prepared model trays for photos. Behind those doors, though, the real meals remained unchanged: old rice, gray chicken, and water thickened with unknown powder. And something worse began happening. Reports came in that guards were spitting in trays out of anger, believing inmates were exaggerating their illnesses. Others dumped meals in front of sick detainees, shouting, "Eat that COVID special." Those stories never made the official reports, but they spread fast inside. Hunger wasn't just physical anymore. It became psychological torture. Then came June 2020. The protests outside over George Floyd's death were filling the streets, and inside Rikers, the tension was like gasoline waiting for a spark. Inmates began refusing their trays again, not just for food, but as protest against the conditions. This time, it wasn't organized by Slim or Truth. It was spontaneous. Entire housing blocks threw their meals back through the slots. Officers panicked. The administration called it civil disobedience. But to the men inside, it was the only language left. A short clip smuggled out that month showed trays flying through the air, crashing against walls smeared with old food. In the background, someone screamed, "We ain't animals." The video went viral again. CNN picked it up. So did the Washington Post. For a brief moment, America saw what Rikers really was: a city-sized machine that controlled people by controlling their hunger. But just as fast as the outrage came, it faded. New York promised reform again. A new food contractor was hired. Health officials claimed improvements. Yet when The Intercept reviewed meals in late 2020, they found the same story: expired goods, contamination, and deliberate shortages. A correction officer, off duty and fed up, left a chilling voicemail to an activist group. It's not incompetence anymore. It's cruelty by design. They feed them like that because it works. By winter, the virus had claimed dozens of lives on the island. The kitchen, now operating under emergency protocols, served vacuum-sealed rations. Tiny packets marked correctional use only. The ingredients were mostly soy protein and powdered potatoes. Some of the labels dated back to 2012. Marcus Hayes, weaker now, wrote in a letter smuggled to his lawyer. They broke the hunger strike by starving the fighters. Now, even the strong ones eat in silence. And yet, even as he faded, his story began reaching ears that mattered: journalists, advocates, even lawmakers. Because when the world finally reopened, Rikers would no longer be able to hide what it had done during lockdown. But the most shocking revelation was still coming: a discovery that proved the food control system wasn't just an internal issue, it was profitable. Money was moving behind the scenes. Contracts, kickbacks, corrupt deals. And the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized Rikers' food crisis wasn't about incompetence or cruelty alone. It was business. A business built on hunger. When the world slowly reopened in 2021, Rikers Island was already in free fall, short-staffed, overcrowded, and now under federal investigation. But as journalists began digging into the crisis, they stumbled upon something even darker. The hunger wasn't accidental. It was profitable. A leaked report from the New York City Comptroller's office revealed that millions of dollars allocated for inmate meals had quietly vanished. The contracts, traced back to 2018, were supposed to fund fresh produce, meat, and kitchen repairs. Instead, those funds went to shell companies, some with no food distribution licenses at all. One of the companies, Metro Provision Supplies LLC, had billed the city over $3.6 million for meal enhancements. Investigators found the address led to a shuttered laundromat in Queens. Another, Prime Core Distribution, charged $1.1 million for emergency protein products, yet not a single delivery record existed. When reporters tried to contact them, the listed number went straight to voicemail. This number is not in service. It was a paper trail of ghosts, and behind it all, a handful of city insiders who quietly benefited while inmates starved. One of the whistleblowers was Officer Raymond Soto, a kitchen supervisor with 14 years inside Rikers. He reached out anonymously to the New York Daily News with hundreds of pages of invoices, purchase orders, and internal memos. His voice shook during the recorded interview. "We were told to sign off on deliveries that never showed up. They said it was a paperwork issue, but every fake invoice meant real food that never came." Soto explained how the food control system went deeper than anyone realized. When certain units were being punished, food deliveries were intentionally delayed, but the invoices still went through, billed as if inmates were fed full portions. That meant the longer inmates went hungry, the more ghost meals could be billed to the city. It wasn't just control anymore. It was corruption disguised as discipline. As the investigation widened, names started to surface: mid-level supervisors, retired wardens, even private contractors linked to political donations. The Department of Investigation, DOI, subpoenaed record from Rikers Food Service Division, uncovering falsified signatures and altered spreadsheets. In one shocking discovery, inspectors found an entire storeroom filled with expired rations marked for destruction, yet those items had already been invoiced as distributed meals. In other words, they were paid for food they never served. An internal email chain dated February 2020 read, "Per directive, limit distribution to IHU. Maintain control logs but confirm full delivery for records." Translation: feed fewer people, but claim full payments. Meanwhile, back inside the island, the impact was visible everywhere. Inmates were emaciated. Skin sagged over bones. Some had gone from 180 pounds to 130 in months. The commissary, the only reliable food source, was out of stock most weeks. Even the guards were struggling. The corruption didn't stop at the gates. It poisoned the entire chain. Officer Soto recalled, "With open boxes of meat that were green, cooks refused to use it. Management said, 'Add vinegar. Make it work.'" The so-called control by hunger wasn't just psychological anymore. It was systemic decay. In October 2021, a group of Rikers inmates filed a class-action lawsuit against New York City, citing deliberate deprivation of adequate nutrition. The plaintiffs, led by Marcus Slim Hayes and several others, alleged that correction officials intentionally withheld food to manipulate behavior and cover up embezzlement. The suit drew national headlines. The Guardian, Vice News, and ProPublica all covered it. Public outrage surged again, demanding justice. But as history had shown, Rikers had a way of burying stories just as fast as they rose. That's when the leaks started again. Anonymous employees began emailing documents to journalists, budget sheets, meal records, internal memos stamped confidential. One of those files, dated March 2021, detailed a meeting where senior officials discussed reducing caloric cost per inmate by 11%. The reason? Operational efficiency amid fiscal constraints. But behind that corporate language was something sinister. They were intentionally cutting food portions to save money, even as inmates starved. Outside the island, the people of New York were losing patience. City council members demanded answers. The mayor's office promised reform. But inside Rikers, the same story continued. Cold bread, gray meat, and disciplinary lows for anyone who spoke out. Slim, now weakened but still defiant, managed to send a final letter to a journalist from the Marshall Project. In shaky handwriting, he wrote, "They use hunger to keep us quiet. But hunger makes noise too, the kind that echoes through the walls." That line hit the city like an explosion. It became the rallying cry for advocates who refused to let the issue fade. Protests erupted outside the Queensboro Bridge entrance to Rikers. Family members held up pictures of their sons and brothers, chanting, "Feed them with dignity." But inside, retaliation continued. Officers started serving smaller portions again. Commissary prices doubled. And word spread that some of the whistleblowers were being reassigned or quietly disappearing from the job roster altogether. Then, in January 2022, the Department of Justice stepped in. A federal grand jury was convened to investigate financial misconduct in the Rikers Island food program. Dozens of witnesses testified. Hundreds of documents were seized. Among them, one shocking ledger stood out, a handwritten notebook labeled Control Measures. Inside were notes that seemed to outline a strategy of compliance management. Light trays for agitators. Extra bread for workers. Freeze non-compliant unit deliveries for 24 hours. At the bottom of the page, one final line stood out, circled in red ink. Food equals order. That phrase summed up the entire philosophy of Rikers Island. The food wasn't about nourishment. It was about dominance. A way to remind every man, every day, who truly controlled their survival. And yet, as the investigation deepened, one final discovery shocked even the most hardened officials. It wasn't just about stolen money. It wasn't just about cruelty or corruption. Investigators had found evidence that some of the food supplied to Rikers, the very meals served to inmates, had come from city waste contracts. Expired food, originally slated for disposal, had been reprocessed and resold to the jail system through intermediaries. It wasn't incompetence. It was intentional recycling of trash into human meals. And the paper trail led straight to a name no one expected. The deeper investigators dug into Rikers Island's food contracts, the more the trail pointed upward, far beyond the kitchen, beyond the wardens, straight into City Hall's contracting network. In early 2022, a confidential informant handed over a flash drive to federal investigators. On it were months of internal recordings, audio files, memos, and one piece of evidence that would shake the system, a secret conversation between two high-ranking officials discussing waste-to-food logistics. The audio was grainy, captured through a smuggled pen recorder, but the words were unmistakable. "They'll never know," one voice said. "It's all under sanitation. They think it's recycling." The other voice responded, almost laughing. "Recycling? Yeah. Trash to trays. That's efficiency, right?" For the first time, investigators had proof expired and discarded city food waste was being reprocessed, repackaged, and sold back to the Department of Correction as fresh inventory. The profits? Massive. The human cost? Unimaginable. The flash drive led them to a company called New Metro Reclaim, a so-called green vendor contracted under the city's sustainability initiative. On paper, they specialize in environmental waste conversion, turning unused groceries into compost. In reality, they were blending expired meat and produce into nutrient paste and reselling it to correctional institutions. Invoices showed tens of thousands of dollars worth of these shipments to Rikers every month, signed and approved by senior purchasing officers. When confronted, one city procurement manager told investigators, "We didn't know. The paperwork said processed protein." But the investigators weren't buying it, because they'd already matched the barcodes on the shipments to waste disposal records from the city's own Department of Sanitation. The same food New York's garbage trucks picked up from supermarkets and restaurants was ending up on inmate trays. Inside Rikers, the inmates had long suspected something was off. The meat had a strange metallic smell. The vegetables came in grayish-green tones. Even seasoned inmates said they'd never seen food like it. Marcus Slim Hayes wrote in his final journal entry from 2022, "The food's not food no more. It's like eating paper soaked in chemicals. They tell us it's protein mix. Feels like punishment disguised as dinner." When forensic analysis was finally done on the food samples smuggled out of Rikers, the results were horrifying. Traces of mold toxins, cleaning agents, and even fragments of plastic. One sample tested positive for chlorpyrifos, a pesticide banned for human consumption. The media storm exploded. "Rikers Island fed inmates recycled trash," screamed the New York Post headline. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Garbage Meals of Rikers, How New York's Jail System Betrayed Its Inmates." For a brief moment, it seemed like justice might finally come. The Department of Correction Commissioner was forced to resign. Several contractors were indicted on charges of fraud, health code violations, and conspiracy to defraud the city. But even as the walls of corruption started to crack, there was one name investigators couldn't ignore. Someone high up, someone powerful enough to approve millions in contracts with a single signature. That name was Deputy Commissioner Harold Green. Green had served in the department for over 20 years. He wasn't known for brutality or scandal, but for silence. The kind of bureaucrat who never drew attention but always seemed to be in the room where decisions were made. Investigators uncovered that Green personally signed off on at least 17 emergency food procurement authorizations between 2019 and 2021, each of them linked to fake shell vendors. But Green's real mistake was caught in an email. In March 2020, as COVID raged through Rikers, he sent a message to a contractor representative. "Do what you have to do. We can't afford shortages. Label it under sustainability." That line sealed his fate. When federal agents raided Green's Staten Island home in July 2022, they found stacks of cash, over $400,000, hidden inside cereal boxes and paint cans. The serial numbers matched the accounts of vendors tied to Rikers' food program. But Green wasn't talking. His only statement to reporters was chillingly short. "They told me to keep the system running. So I did." Inside Rikers, word spread fast. Inmates cheered when they heard Green's name on the news. But for Marcus Hayes and others, it was bittersweet. The damage was already done. Hundreds of men had suffered. Some had lifelong health complications. A few had died. Yet, when the trial began, Green's defense team argued he was just a cog in the system. They said the corruption went far beyond him, into city politics, campaign donations, and construction deals tied to the plan to eventually close Rikers Island by 2027. The courtroom fell silent when prosecutors played the secret audio recording for the first time. The laughter about trash to trays. It was a sound of cruelty becoming routine. But even as the case gained momentum, witnesses began disappearing. One former kitchen employee who testified vanished 2 weeks before the final hearing. Another officer resigned and left the state. It became clear that Rikers wasn't just a jail. It was an empire. And empires don't collapse quietly. Investigators knew there was still someone out there. Someone bigger. Someone who'd orchestrated the entire food-as-control operation. The person who'd built a policy that allowed trash to be turned into meals and punishment to masquerade as procedure. The same person who had signed the original behavioral management directive years ago under a different administration. That file, now sealed under confidential state policy archives, contained the initials JM. The initials JM became the obsession of everyone involved in the case, journalists, lawyers, even federal prosecutors. Who was this person? And how could one signature create an entire system of control that weaponized food itself? After months of digging, a retired records clerk finally came forward with a dusty folder from 2016. Inside was a memorandum titled Behavioral Regulation Through Nutritional Incentives. It was signed by Jonathan Marks, former Deputy Director of Operations for the New York City Department of Correction. Marks was a policy strategist, not a corrections officer, not a warden. His background was in behavioral psychology. Before joining the department, he'd worked on research about compliance through deprivation. And in his memo, he had written the blueprint for what Rikers would become. Nutritional restriction, the document read, is an effective nonviolent behavioral control mechanism. Predictable hunger elicits compliance faster than punitive segregation. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was proud of it. Mark's proposal was supposed to be academic, a theory on reducing inmate violence without physical confrontation. But somewhere along the line, it became policy. Wardens implemented it. Officers enforced it. And the kitchen turned it into reality. Marks left the department quietly in 2018. He took a consulting position with a private corrections vendor, the same one that had later supplied Rikers with its nutrient blend. The same company tied to the waste contracts. When confronted by reporters in 2023, Jonathan Marks refused to go on camera. He issued a brief written statement. The goal was reform, not harm. Misuse of policy by bad actors does not reflect my intent. But intent doesn't erase impact, because by then, the damage had already carved itself into the lives of thousands. Men like Marcus Slim Hayes, who had spent years fighting the hunger system from the inside, had become symbols of resistance, not by choice, but by survival. In one of his last interviews before being transferred to another facility, he said, "They thought food was control, but it turned us into brothers. We shared the little we had. They can take the trays, but not the truth." When you look at Rikers Island today, you won't see open violence on the yard or riots in the mess hall. What you'll see is something quieter, something colder. A system that learned how to control people without leaving bruises. Because at Rikers, food isn't just food. It's a message. Every tray that slides through a cell door carries a choice. Eat and comply, or starve and resist. It's the kind of punishment that doesn't make noise, doesn't make headlines, but breaks the human spirit all the same. And yet, behind those walls, the men who refused to bow became something stronger. Their hunger exposed a truth too big to ignore, that cruelty doesn't always come from violence. Sometimes, it's served 3 times a day. The investigations may lead to trials, policies may change, and new faces may run the system. But the lesson remains. Control, once learned, doesn't disappear. It evolves. Rikers Island isn't just a place. It's a reflection of how far society will go when it forgets that even the guilty deserve dignity. And in the end, one haunting line from Slim's final letter says it all. We were starving, but not silent.